Hello, thank you very much for watching this video. It's this time in English because I have a very special guest today, Patrick McKeown, and he's a great expert in his field. So really, thank you for your time and effort to be in this interview with me. And yeah, well, let's start, I think, Patrick, because you're a breathing expert for so many years as well. And what is it actually why you went into breathing? Because you did not were on high school and you were thinking like, hi, I become a breathing coach, did you?
Yeah, I suppose breathing is not an occupation that you're going to choose to go into. Sometimes life kind of steers you in certain directions. And the one thing about breathing is, and I'd never make a claim to know everything about it because it's so vast and it's so deep. And the more you work with breathing, the more you realize what you don't know.
Yes, yes,
And it's just
definitely.
one of those amazing things. But I came across by accident 20 years ago, 22 years ago, and I was a chronic mouth breather. And if you're a chronic mouth breather, you tend to breathe faster and more upper chest. And as a result, I was more in a fight or flight response. I was stressed as a result of it. My sleep was terrible. I was snoring. I was stopping breathing during sleep. I was waking up feeling exhausted. I was falling asleep in school. And, I was often dismayed that I knew when I was in primary school, which is a school that we attend from the age of about 4 years of age to about 11, I was very bright and I was well up there at the top of the class. But in secondary school or high school, I went from towards the top of the class right down to the bottom. And we often grade children's intelligence on the basis of what they achieve in exams. And my going from the top of the class to the bottom of the class had nothing got to do with intelligence. It had got to do with poor sleep. So my grading was on the back of fatigue and poor concentration. And I can only imagine that there's thousands of children in the same position.
Yeah, as young
But
as you were. I mean,
as young, and at the time you don't realize it, and the teacher is accusing you of being kind of inattentive, that you don't have the capacity. And of course, for a child, it can be very frustrating. It doesn't do much for their self-esteem because
definitely.
they're wondering, like, am I stupid because I can't remember information that my peers can remember? So I read a newspaper article back in 1998, and it was about the work of a Russian doctor. And it said, basically, he said two things. He said, breathe through your nose, in and out. And he said, breathe light. You should never have detectable breathing during rest. And when I read this, I said, okay, this is not me, because I was chronic mouth breather, continuously breathing through my mouth during sleep, during rest, during physical exercise. And also you could hear my breathing. And parents, when I go to school, when I go to parents' houses and we'd be having something to eat as children, the parents often made the comment that I was eating with my mouth open. And of course, it's not very nice, but of course I was eating with my mouth open because I needed my mouth to breathe and to eat at the same time. So all of these little things kind of stick with you. Yeah, so I put this into practice for my own health, and it made an enormous difference. And I was, at the time, like very few people even teaching or even understanding about the importance of nose breathing. Nobody was talking about it really. And this is only back in 2002, So when I trained, I changed careers. I went from a background of economics and social sciences to teaching breathing. And it was just something I felt good about. So I think it was gut instinct. I
Yeah.
felt that there was something, this was the road that I was going to travel.
Yeah. So I breathe through my mouth now.
That's fine.
It's the awareness of breathing through my nose. I think about 10 years. I'm in the breathing business for about 18 years, and I discovered about more than 10 years ago, I think. And my son had asthma, and then I read and learned more about that, and then we learned a lot about it, that he has to use his nose as well, and it really helps. But I think always I combine you with the nose breathing, and I think that's so important for people to know, because I always teach people that as well. In normal breathing, please use your nose, and so many people I help with that, just the simple tips that they are. And what is it when you would because a friend of mine, she's a medical doctor, and I interviewed you, and she said, okay, ask him when you can explain in just a few sentences for a medical doctor and normal people, not medical doctors, the findings, the importance of and the effects of nasal breathing, of using your nose.
Well, just first and foremost, if we look at, I had to reach over to get this anatomical model because it's the easiest way to explain it.
Yeah.
Here is an anatomical model of the face. So you see the nose here and you see the lips. If you look at the mouth here, if you breathe air in through the mouth, there is absolutely no function provided by the mouth in terms of breathing. So any air that's brought into the mouth is straight down the throat, and there's no function by the mouth. Now, if you look at the nose, you've got small nostrils here, which speed up air. The air then goes into a larger chamber, so particulate matter gets deposited inside in the chamber. The air is swirled in turbinates, and there's a large amount of blood flow going through the nose, which heats the air and moistens the air. You also have nasal nitric oxide, which is secreted by the nasal cavity and also from the paranasal sinuses. And when you breathe through your nose, nasal nitric oxide, as it's carried into the lungs, helps to redistribute the blood throughout the lungs. And nose breathing helps to redistribute the air throughout the lungs. Nose breathing slows down breathing, and slow breathing is helpful for oxygen transfer to take place from the lungs into the blood. But also with slow breathing, you're probably more likely to have a normal minute ventilation or a normal volume of breathing. So carbon dioxide in the blood is normal. And carbon dioxide is not just a waste gas, but it's responsible. Some of the functions include, it helps to open up and relax blood vessels. So for example, people with poor breathing patterns, they often have a tendency towards cold hands, cold feet, brain fog. So I think it's a balance. I think it's about realizing the impact that your nose, your mouth just isn't for breathing. Our mouth was not designed at all for breathing. There is nothing provided by the mouth in terms of breathing.
No.
By breathing through your nose, it's a backup. And even in an emergency, I would say that our ancestors only switched to mouth breathing in absolute times of emergency. Even during physical exercise, they breathed through their nose during exercise. And that's why mouth breathing is synonymous with fight or flight. Like I often ask my students, look down at your chest, take a breath through the mouth. And when you breathe through your mouth, are you breathing using the upper regions of the lungs? Or do you have a good amplitude of the diaphragm breathing muscle? And almost always, mouth breathing is synonymous with upper chest breathing. And then when we think of the human lungs itself, the greatest concentration of blood in the human lungs because of gravity is in the lower regions. So if we are ventilating the upper regions and the greatest concentration of blood is in the lower regions, well, that's going to impair the gas transfer from the lungs into the blood. So, for example, back in 1988, researchers realized that when patients had their jaws wired shut, which forced them to continuously breathe through the nose, the PO2 in the blood increased by 10%. And that's the concentration of oxygen in the blood as determined by the PO2 from the lungs. So I will go without saying that it's amazing that nasal breathing hasn't got any attention. For example, children who are mouth breathing, it causes undevelopment of the jaws, overcrowding of teeth, a smaller airway. These children have poor sleep. It increases their risk of special education needs because of their poor sleep, which can be contributed to by mouth breathing. Adults who are mouth breathing, they are 1.8 times more likely to have sleep disorder breathing. It increases the risk of obstructive sleep apnea. It dries out the mouth. They're more prone to dental cavities, gum disease. Drying out of the mouth and the airway, as moisture is sucked out of the airways are prone to inflammation. And when we talk about asthma, it may not be the carbon dioxide theory, which is explaining why people get bronchoconstriction, but just by breathing through the mouth, you don't get the filtration mechanism, you don't get the warming, you don't get the moistening, and you don't get the bronchodilation from nitric oxide. And even just thinking about COVID, nitric oxide is an antiviral. And you could argue, I'm not saying that nasal breathing is going to prevent the infection by COVID, but what I am saying is that it will reduce viral load.
Yeah.
And if you can reduce viral load by virtue of breathing through your nose, it may be giving enough time for the immune system to launch an effective attack against it.
Yeah.
And this was written most recently in a paper written by researchers from Taiwan, looking at the importance of nose breathing for reducing the risk of transmission of COVID. And we were talking about this, of course, back in early March. And yet nobody kind of picked up on it. People were all talking about washing their hands. But if you think of somebody that's close by to us, and if that person is infected with COVID, they'll generally have a breathing problem. They don't feel that they feel that they are not getting enough air through their nose. And as a result, because of COVID, they are more likely to mouth breathe. And mouth breathing, there's a 42% water loss out through the mouth. 42%. So a person who is infected with COVID is going to be breathing a lot of moisture into the atmosphere. And if somebody next to them, it's increasing their risk of transmission. So I think sometimes we have to go back to basics with this one.
Yeah, definitely. And for me, it was new that nose breathing was also nitric oxide helping, because I have this in my closet, and I only thought it helps because it's really important, because I have I don't know the English translation, phenomenon of Renault. I don't know.
Raynaud's, yeah.
And I already had it since I was a child. I don't know better. I was always dead fingers and whatever. So I used this for a long time, and because I thought food is the only thing to increase it, actually. And then through you, I read a lot of more about it. So it's even more important for the veins and so many things, actually.
Yeah, the nitric oxide from the nose was first discovered on the breath of the exhale breath in 1991. So it's a very recent discovery. And it's probable that the nitric oxide from the nose is isolated to the lungs. That the nitric oxide from the nose is just helping in terms of the airways. But it's an amazing molecule, nitric oxide. And it plays a really tremendous role in terms of respiratory health, in sterilizing the incoming air, in redistributing the blood throughout the lungs, in bronchodilation, in signaling molecule for the upper airways during sleep. It's an amazing molecule, NOs.
Yeah, lovely. Well, thank you. That's great. Oh, I have so many questions. I have my participants, I asked some questions from what do you want me to ask? And one of them is also, why do people yawn? And why do they sometimes, and then I mean not before sleeping, then they're tired. When I was brought up, I had to go to church every week when I was a child. And I must say, I was always yawning. And then my mom said, like, don't do that. I'm sorry, I can't help it. And so I'm always thinking in the church and yawning. But I mean, there are so many people who do that. And I tried to read a lot about it. But what I discovered was also that it was a lot not they didn't know about. So do you know something more, maybe?
No, I don't. I don't think it's understood why we yawn. But
no.
It seems to be more common as well, from our perspective, for people who have breathing pattern disorders. That people with breathing pattern disorders with a tendency towards breathing a little bit faster in upper chest breathing, that they can have a tendency towards yawning, and also a tendency towards sighing.
Towards sighing?
Sigh.
Oh,
sighing.
Yes,
sighing.
Yeah.
So we see both of those things, that every time that they have an excessive yawn, or if they have frequent yawning or frequent sighing, it's helping to maintain the breathing pattern disorder. Yeah. So we try and pay particular attention to it. And also when people then start doing the slow, reduced volume breathing, it activates the parasympathetic response, and they do become drowsy and they do actually start to yawn. So when people change their breathing patterns, it can contribute to yawning as well.
Yeah. Because I used connected breathing quite a lot, and not everybody, but a lot of people in the beginning, when they start connecting breathing, and then they start inhale and exhale a lot, and then I think about 20% or something of the people, they start yawning, and then they're distracted by that. And the funny thing is, I'm quite direct and I say, after say 6 yawnings, I say, and now you just stop doing that, start breathing. They do it. Isn't that funny?
Yes, yeah,
I always
yeah,
think that's
yeah,
really
totally.
amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, it is. Yeah, 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 yeah.
So they can stop it when they want.
Mm.
Yeah.
But I wonder, are they suppressing it, or is it just by mental will that it just doesn't happen? So I don't know. That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting thing, I think, the
Mm-hmm.
yawning, yes. And what do you think about different breathing theories and theories and techniques? Because there are so many, and I love it that there are so many, because I always think, yeah, well, every technique does something else. And in the beginning, I heard about Buteco. At least how they taught me Buteco. It was so strict, and I did not measure with my values in life in a way, because it was so strict, and also because I loved the connected breathing, and it was like the opposite. But now I don't think it anymore. But it's just another way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how do you think about that? The different type of breathing techniques which are in the world now.
Yeah, I think we should look at any breathing exercise or any breathing technique in terms of the impact it has on the physiology of the body.
Yeah.
And when you're looking at body physiology, number one is biochemistry. Now, these aren't in any particular order, but I'll talk about, say, four dimensions in terms of the breath. And if people understand the four dimensions, then if they're trying a particular breathing technique, they could ask, well, maybe this breathing technique is fulfilling one of these dimensions or a number of these.
Yeah.
From a biochemical point of view, Buteco is very much changing the biochemistry, and that's through carbon dioxide. And it's generally having the individual to slow down and to reduce their breathing volume, to increase carbon dioxide in the blood, to improve the biochemistry of the breath. So that's from a biochemical point of view. The second dimension to breathing is ask, what impact is the breathing exercise having on the biomechanics of breathing in terms of improving the amplitude of the diaphragm? So that as we breathe in, that the diaphragm is moving downwards, and as the diaphragm is moving back up to its resting position, we're having an exhalation. The third dimension that we should look at in terms of breathing is the influence it has on the autonomic nervous system. So, for example, the balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic, stimulating the vagus nerve, exercising baroreceptors or pressure receptors in the major blood vessels. And that in turn, then the combination of stimulating the vagus nerve and exercising the baroreceptors, the influence that then has on heart rate variability. And heart rate variability then as a measure of vagal tone or functioning of the autonomic nervous system. And then the fourth dimension that we could be looking at is the impact of the technique, any breathing technique, in terms of what it's doing to stress the body. That by, say, for instance, hyperventilating, strong breath holds, these are stressors. So these are designed often to get that person out of the state that they are in, to reset.
Yeah.
So I'm always thinking about, if somebody was giving me a breathing technique, I'm always wondering, well, what's it doing to the biochemistry? Or if it's not doing anything to the biochemistry, what's it doing to the biomechanics? Or if it's not doing anything to the biomechanics, what does it do to the vagus nerve, etc.? Or is it a stressor? And from that, then it gives me just a better understanding that I can look at different breathing techniques, and I can see what are they focusing on.
Yeah.
And the other thing about looking at breathing from a wider perspective is that we have to realize there's no point in focusing on one dimension of breathing and sacrificing the other in the process. And that can often happen because you can have maybe one breathing instructor will tell their students, now what I want you to do is take full big breaths, and I want you to bring the air down deep into the abdomen. And with this, then you're focusing on the biomechanics of the breath. But in the process, the student, by taking these full big breaths, it may lead to an increase in minute ventilation, that the amount of air that they are breathing is too much. And in the process, it blows off too much carbon dioxide to cause hypocapnia, which then is, of course, it's hyperventilation. So my point here is that you can have a teacher focused on solely one dimension, and they may not realize the impact that their breathing technique is having on the other dimensions. And from my perspective, I will always ask, if I'm teaching this technique to somebody, what impact is it having on the different dimensions in terms of breathing?
Yeah. Yeah, I look at it from a yoga perspective. So I look at it like when I hear it, then I think also you make four different things in the body, and when I hear it right, then in yoga you have, they always say the physical, physical body, the emotional body, and the mental body, and the spiritual part you have. But, so the emotions, you could say that's like your third thing you think about the stressor. Is that the way you see it then? Just to compare. Is that what you mean then?
Well, say for instance, if I have somebody then coming in with anxiety, because say for instance, then I have somebody coming in from anxiety, I will want to work with them from a biochemical point of view, because I can increase blood flow to the brain, and I can increase oxygen delivery to the brain, and I can also help to calm down the central nervous system. You know, if they have agitation of the mind in terms of brain cell excitability. But then I'll also teach them breathing with the diaphragm with greater amplitudes, because of the connection between the diaphragm and the brain. And then I will teach them slowing down their breathing to a cadence of 5.5 and 6 breaths per minute to stimulate the vagus nerve to help bodily systems disturbed by stress. And then at night, I will have them do slow, reduced breathing to help them switch off before they go to sleep. And then during sleep, we have them wear tape so that they have a deeper sleep. So say from an emotional point of view, I'm going to go through all of the different dimensions, but I'm often afraid. I've made mistakes with people with anxiety coming in and panic disorder. And these people are already switched on. And then if I give them breath holding, I can put them into such a fight or flight response, and it has the opposite effect. And I've seen it with some people. I've put people into panic attacks from doing breathing exercises. And this is something that you learn with breathing.
My experience from that, I thought, oh, I never had it. And suddenly it was not a bad panic attack, but it was like my body went in something. I thought, oh my gosh, I couldn't stop breathing. And just like that, I never had that. And
yes.
at the time I was experimenting with the Buteyko exercises. So I think I did them too well or something like that. And then I was like,
you overdid it.
God,
yes.
what's happening to me? And then a lot of people emailed me from all over the country and for the same question. And I thought, yeah, well, I recognize it. So do something wrong, I know. But then I thought, okay, that's not the way for me. So we always have to look at, so it's so nice you say that. So thank you. Because then you have to look at, okay, what is working then?
Yeah, and that's it. And so you're kind of like, everybody that's coming in front of you is a little... Hello, it's frozen there, actually. I don't know what happened there.
Me neither.
But yeah, that's the beauty about having a bigger toolbox of breathing exercises, that you can choose different techniques then, and you can change the program then to suit the individual. Because somebody coming in with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia is going to be very much different to an athlete coming in. And the other thing, Helene, that we need to be talking about is breathing for women is very much different to breathing for men.
I have it here. So lovely. Well, tell me.
Well, in terms of breathing for women is very much different. Say women under 50 years of age who are, if they have, for instance, they're going through the monthly cycle. In days 10 to 22 of the monthly cycle during the luteal phase, there is an increase in the hormone progesterone, which is a respiratory stimulant, which causes the female to breathe harder during that time. And as you breathe harder, it actually increases pain perception. So if you hyperventilate as a result of the change of hormones, the woman can feel more pain. And with that hyperventilation, they can also experience panic, anxiety, and fatigue. So there are some women who could be diagnosed with fibromyalgia at different times of their monthly cycle, but then they wouldn't be diagnosed with fibromyalgia at other times of their monthly cycle.
The other 2 weeks.
And that's exactly it. And it's really bizarre. And, you know, me as a man, I was very slow to move into looking at women's breathing. And I have to base it like 50% of my students would have been female over the last nearly 20 years. And yet I didn't consider, and most research doesn't consider the difference between female breathing and male breathing. No. And I'll give you an example. Yesterday I got an email in from a mother, and her son is using the breathing techniques to help with his sports. And she's going through night sweats. So she started taping her mouth at night, and her night sweats have considerably reduced. Now, what's going on there? I have no idea. But I wonder, is she breathing hard and fast during her sleep? And it's putting her into a sympathetic dominance. Yeah. And just by breathing through the nose, it's slowing down everything. And she's getting a deeper sleep. And as a result, then she's not getting the night sweats. Yeah. So for women then, in terms of, you know, pain, fatigue, anxiety, mood, sleep, and also then in latter years as well, post 50, the impact that breathing could have there. And, you know, it's kind of bizarre. It's bizarre as well that when we look at research in female, there's no consideration of the monthly cycle.
No, it's what I always say of what I heard, and I thought that sounds good. Because a lot of scientists are men, and they Correct. Always say when the men would have had a monthly period, there would have been so many research done. Then they would have thought, well, we're gonna fix this. And we women, we more like the silent suffering and. It's stupid actually, but there's not so many reasons.
Yeah, it makes absolutely no sense. So I'm writing a new book at the moment, and it's quite a large book. It's 150,000 words, but we've put in a chapter for females.
Oh, great!
And we've put in a chapter for epilepsy, and for type 1 diabetes, and for the relationship between dysfunctional breathing and lower back pain. And a lot of this information, like. The information on women has been written about since 1905. This is not new. I put in a chapter on children and craniofacial development in terms of mouth versus nasal breathing. None of this stuff is new, you know, but yet nobody seems to know about it. And even the Bohr effect, which was discovered back in 1904, that carbon dioxide, the pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood, is a catalyst for hemoglobin, which is a protein in the red blood cell which carries oxygen. But for hemoglobin to release oxygen to the tissues and organs, it's released in the presence of carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is one of the catalysts for the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. Despite that, so many people never think about carbon dioxide. They think about oxygen, and they have an idea that it's good to breathe more air so that we're bringing more oxygen into the lungs. Yeah. And number one, it doesn't increase the saturation of the blood with oxygen. But more air we breathe, we get rid of too much carbon dioxide, and the available oxygen in the blood doesn't get delivered. Yeah. So we have to sometimes look at breathing differently.
How do you see like a breathing technique like holotropic breath from Stanislav Grof? And his research was mostly about psychedelics and LSD and things like that. And then he discovered, hey, you can also have the same things through breathing. And I love that part. I love the natural high. And that's such a different way of looking at things. And it's all the breath, isn't it? And so how do you see that?
With holotropic, it's going to be it's a stressor.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if I have an understanding of what's exactly going on there, or if anybody has an understanding.
No, I also think that. I think there's not enough research. No.
There's not. And the other thing is, you know, hyperventilation is a very natural occurrence during sex. So when people are having sex, there is a tendency to hyperventilate. And sometimes I wonder is there something happening there? You know, that there is a time and place for hyperventilation, to cause adaptations, and something is definitely happening. But we also have to bear in mind that after hyperventilation, how do you breathe?
Yeah.
Like you do your hyperventilation for 20 minutes, for 30 minutes. Perfect. I'm concerned now, how do you breathe when you're finished your hyperventilation? How do you breathe when you walk down the street? How do you breathe when you're asleep? How do you breathe when you do your physical exercise? So there's no doubt, like there's definitely, there's a time and place for everything.
Yeah, yeah. And I must say, in the beginning, I learned that technique. They learned me to have the hyperventilation part, and then to rest. And then I knew people who did not take enough rest, and that's not good. So I'll always do my best to my participant. When you have, I always call it the active breathing.
Yes.
And you have the passive breathing, and sometimes it's difficult for people to go there. And I always say, as a coach, you have to use your coach skills, so they go deep, and then the body is really like, it hardly starts. It's hardly breathing anymore. That's so nice.
Yes.
And that's so great, because people feel then more relaxed than they have done in years sometimes, and then they connect with the really parasympathetic feeling, the really relaxation, like, oh yes, I knew this, I've forgotten how it felt. And then in normal breathing, they have to shut their mouth and start to
But this may be part of why it's working, because if you hyperventilate, you blow off a lot of carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is the stimulant to breathe. So if you deplete carbon dioxide in the blood after the hyperventilation, the carbon dioxide in the blood is quite low, and it can take a while for carbon dioxide to increase. And as a result, people post hyperventilation, they will have very light breathing, very slow breathing, very calm breathing. But there is a part in the brain which is spying on our breathing, in the locus coeruleus. And when we breathe slowly, this part of the brain will send signals of calm to the rest of the brain. So it could be the slow breathing that's happening as a result of the hyperventilation that may contribute to the person then realizing just what it feels like to be calm.
Yeah, to remember it again.
And it could be, yes.
Yeah, and that's nice. Very good. Do you know why there are more men in the breathing world who are the teachers? That's what maybe it's a difficult question, but I thought, because I know so many men who are good and who are good teachers, and then I know Judith Griffiths. She's I don't know if you know her, but from transformational breathing. She is a big name, and she did a lot of good work in the whole world about conscious breathing technique. But actually, she's the only one who's a really big name, I think.
I don't know, but you can ask the same question. Why are many of the people who are teaching yoga, the ones that are the teachers, are often men as well? And yet when you go to a yoga class, most of the students are female.
Yeah.
And when we ask with breathing, we also ask the question with breathing. Breathing affects women. This breathing pattern disorders affect more women than men. And in some studies, it was 2 times. But I've even seen it being mentioned that it could be 7 times more women are affected by breathing pattern disorders as men. I think it's because men probably have the benefit that they don't have the dual purpose of looking after kids and being involved with a family, that oftentimes it's the female that will take care of the family. And as a result, then the female's time is divided between occupation and family, whereas the man is maybe able to spend more time on occupation. And maybe that could be part of the reason. And females, if they're going to have kids, they have to give up. They have to have a career break, etc.
Yeah.
And maybe female, the value can be different. That it's not that kind of a better balance. Because I think with men, sometimes we go to complete, sometimes absolute extremes, that we're so focused on something that we're tunnel vision, as opposed to looking at getting the balance between the different parts in life.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, we will see, and it doesn't matter in a way that there are
Well,
more men.
it's all about the teaching, isn't it?
It is definitely it is. Yeah. So the time will tell how it goes. Yeah. Is there something else you would love to share to the people in Holland, and maybe somebody?
Yeah, I think, in terms of people who work in breathing, the depth of breathing is amazing. The more we go down there, and I'm sure they already have an appreciation of what we can do. Like even just looking at the whole aspect of heart rate variability and the synchronicity between our breathing and the timing between our heartbeats, that therapists have known this for many, many years. That as you breathe in, which is more sympathetically driven, active part of the breath during rest, but as you breathe in, the heartbeat is faster. And as you breathe out, which is parasympathetically driven, the timing between heartbeats is longer because the heartbeat is slower. So on the breath in, our heartbeat is faster, and on the breath out during rest, our heartbeat is slower. And we can influence that, and that's exactly what we need. That's a good measure of autonomic functioning. That we want the timing between our heartbeats to be random, but also to be in rhythm.
Yeah.
But a person who is disturbed by stress, and when I'm talking about this, it's very difficult to clinically measure stress in the human body. If you've had a couple that are after having a divorce, that's a big stressor. And if there's tension involved, it's even worse again. But you can measure the impact of the divorce on the individual by measuring their heart rate variability. So heart rate variability can be a marker of determining stress. And more importantly, how do you improve HRV? You do that by slow breathing. And then to realize that everything is interconnected. For example, when we have people with their mouths taped at night, they have a deeper sleep and their heart rate variability increases, versus if they have their mouth wide open. So if you wake up with a dry mouth in the morning, you're more likely to be snoring, you're more likely to have obstructive sleep apnea, but you don't get that deep sleep and you don't get that recovery. So if our sleep is good, then automatically our mood is better, our focus is better, our energy is better, and then we tend to be calmer. And when we are calmer, our breathing is calmer. And when we slow down, when we breathe through the nose, our nose is connected more so to the amplitude of the diaphragm. And when we breathe with greater amplitude of the diaphragm, it's easier for us to breathe slow. And when we breathe slow, we can increase heart rate variability. That I think we need to be looking at breathing in terms of a connectivity of all of those dimensions together. And is there a way to breathe to increase alveolar oxygen, alveolar ventilation? Is there a way to breathe during COVID? If you're climbing up altitude, is there a way to breathe? There's so much here. And if you look at the literature in terms of individuals who have post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, asthma, COPD, irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, hypertension, hypotension, diabetes, most common conditions, all of those conditions can be influenced by your breathing. And I'm not saying that this is a cure-all, but all I'm saying is this: if somebody has a condition, if they think it can be, or if they wonder, can slow breathing make a difference? Put in their condition into PubMed or into Google, and put in, say, for instance, irritable bowel syndrome, and then put in heart rate variability. Because then you can see, is there research, because all of the research on breathing is not on breathing. All of the research on breathing is on heart rate variability. Yeah. So when I'm looking at a condition, I'm wondering, can I influence this condition? And I will look to see, is there any research on improving the heart rate variability for this condition? And when you improve a HRV, did it make a difference to this condition? If it does, well, then we know that possibly we can help this condition because we should be able to improve heart rate variability. And by increasing heart rate variability, which is a marker of the functioning of the vagus nerve, we then know that we can influence this condition. Yeah. So, you know, for people who are working with breathing, it's the field is wide open. Yeah. And it's the first time the last 2 years have been a huge awareness of breathing. And for example, there's a new book on the breath that just came out in May. It's out in May in the United States. I only have the printed copy. It was sent to me by the publishers, but it's the name of it is Breath, yeah. The New Science of a Last Art by James Nestor. He's a journalist in the United States. Now that's an amazing piece of work. Yeah. And it's an amazing piece of work in that an investigative journalist has uncovered the links that we have been talking about for 20 years. But maybe people don't necessarily want to listen to somebody who's teaching breathing. No. Maybe it takes somebody who's coming in from a place that they are not involved with breathing, that they are an outsider, because that book already is destined to be a New York Times bestseller. Yeah. And this book is going to raise it for everybody. And he does look at Wim Hof technique. He does look at holotropic breathing. He does look at nasal breathing, yeah. And he brings them together. Yeah. And that's what we want with the breath. We needed a resource like that because I think even with breathing, we are all stuck in our little silos. Mm. And the other thing is that there's very few people who are really actively out there. I'm an introvert, by the way. I'm not an extrovert. I can happily talk here, but if I go to a big meeting and there's 1,000 people at it, I will hide away in a corner somewhere. I don't want to be talking to people. I like talking one-to-one. I like having a conversation like this. And I think people who are into breathing are very much inward perspective. Okay. So they are focused inward. So as a result, society doesn't always kind of recognize the value or the benefit because we aren't the ones to be putting it out there. And there's very few exceptions. Wim Hof, in my opinion, is the only individual who has really been able to put it out there by virtue of his feats, getting attention, and also when he's talking, and he's able to put it out there. And that's the exception rather than the rule. And this also why breathing is not getting the attention. And of course, it comes down to finances, you know. If breathing would make money for big companies, there would be lots of research on breathing. Definitely. But breathing will not make big money for companies. In actual fact, breathing could reduce the money that's made by big companies, and especially the whole pharmaceutical industry. So that's why research isn't going to happen. No. Or if it does, research is slow. But I think there is more and more research. It's happening. Yeah. It's probably not happening at the pace that we should be thinking about it, but we have to bear this in mind.
That's also with Wim Hof, because I've known him years ago. I was a student of him about 9 years ago. And he was not as famous in that time. But he always said, I suffered for 30 years. And I told all those years, I told exactly the same. I didn't do anything. But he had to wait. He had to wait and he had to fight. And he told about 15 years ago, he had in New York some science they should do. And then just a few days before he would go there, they said, yeah, we'll cancel it. And it was different why. It was not clear why. And he said just suddenly it was like that, no. And he thought, okay, the doctor seemed really interested, and probably the doctor was, but there was no finances suddenly, and the doctor probably was ticked on his fingers, like, don't do that.
Yes.
And you have to do something else. And so suddenly it was possible, research, but Wim did his best for so many years, and suddenly it was like, boom.
Yes, no, it's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. We see it with asthma societies. Yeah. Asthma societies around the world.
Yeah.
They represent children and adults with asthma.
Yeah.
They never talk about nasal breathing.
No.
They never talk about people with asthma having poor sleep.
Nothing about
Nothing.
breathing. Oh, nothing. That's terrible, actually.
Totally. So there is really vested interests as well here.
Yeah.
But in saying this has gave the power of the internet and the power of books, because a person can spend 10-15 euro on a book. And that's why I wrote my first book back in 2003. And I wrote it because I didn't want the information just to be stuck in my head. And what's the best way to get the information out there but to put it into a book and for people to read books and to practice it themselves. And if they have a stuffy nose, that they can decongest their nose by holding their breath. If they tape up their mouth at night, does it make a difference to how they feel when they get up the next morning? If they go for a run with their mouth closed, yes, initially it's a bit more difficult, but the more they practice running with the mouth closed, they've got better recovery, better oxygenation, less trauma to the airways, better functional movement. And I think it's really about getting people to practice it. And with the breath, first do no harm. That when it's practice, especially functional breathing. And here's something that really I often wonder at. The literature shows, a Cochrane review back in 2013 showed that dysfunctional breathing patterns affects about 9.5% of the population, 10% of the adult population. Okay, it's quite a lot when you consider Ireland is a population of 4.5 million people. You're talking about 500,000 people in one country, small country. But in the asthma population, it's as high as 30%. Now, I think it's higher with asthma, but the literature says it's 30% of the asthma population have dysfunctional breathing. But in the anxiety population, it's 80%. Now, 80% have dysfunctional breathing. And what that basically means is that the anxiety and panic disorder population, when you look at dysfunctional breathing, the most common element of that is hyperventilation. And all they are doing is just breathing a little bit faster and a little bit upper chest. Now, you can imagine the amount of people with anxiety and panic disorder, and they go to their psychotherapist, they go to their psychologist, they go to their psychiatrist, and very little attention is paid on improving their breathing patterns, and very little attention is paid on their sleep. And I remember one woman coming into me, and I often use the same example. She was in her 30s, and she was suffering from decades of, at least a decade of depression. And I asked her, I says, when you wake up in the morning, how do you feel? And she said, I wake up and I feel absolutely exhausted. And I said, has your doctor ever looked at your sleep? Has your doctor ever asked you, how deep is your sleep? How good is your sleep? Have you ever done a sleep study? And she said, no. And I think it's because her doctor was assuming it's her depression which is causing her to be exhausted. But maybe we should be changing that thinking. Maybe it's the exhaustion which is causing depression. Because if you're exhausted from poor quality sleep, you're going to be more anxious because you cannot function in a day-to-day basis. And if you've got prolonged anxiety over weeks and months, it could contribute to depression. And sometimes we have to ask what's causing what, because there is often there's often a feedback loop here. The person who gets stressed, they breathe harder, they breathe faster, they breathe upper chest. And this faster and harder and upper chest breathing is feeding back into their stress. So it's that loop. And that's why the human body, it's so intelligent, but it's so complex. And, a little bit more investigation. And I suppose we have to understand the human body from how everything is interlinked, that it's not just divided into separate components. You go to your ear, nose, and throat doctor, and he or she is looking at your nose and throat. And then you go to your pulmonologist, and he or she is looking at your lungs. Whereas in actual fact, since 2007, it was said there's only one airway. Because if you have asthma, the inflammation of the lungs travels up to your nose, so you're more likely to have nasal problems. And if you have nasal problems, it's more likely to travel down to your lungs. And if you have sleep problems, it's often associated with mouth breathing because of nasal obstruction. But mouth breathing is causing upper chest breathing. And when we breathe using the upper chest, we have a reduction to lung volume that the throat collapses more easily. So there's such a interconnectedness here that I think, you know, it needs to be explored.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we have time. It's just beginning. That's good. Oh, and I have one question here before I forget it. My participants ask, because I do this with them, why are we nodding actually? They ask why.
The nodding is just a distraction.
Oh, it's that.
Yeah, I don't think it's increasing blood flow or anything like that.
No.
And in actual fact, you
So
get
in
a better.
theory, you can sit still, but it's.
Well, yeah, it's easier if you're holding your breath. It's easier if you do it with movement.
Yeah.
Because the movement is distracting you, and probably also the movement, of course, is going to be generate more carbon dioxide. Now, you could ask a question: how does that exercise work? We don't know.
No. Okay. No.
And you know, we know it works.
I thought, I didn't looked it up.
No. I've had about 8,000 people in front of me face to face, and I've had them all do that exercise. Or either that, if it's still stuffy, what I do is, and even just an hour ago, I had a guy with nasal polyps. And nasal polyps is typically, well, like this growth in the nose, but it's typically alleviated by nasal surgery. And I said, okay, you've nasal polyps. I'm not sure if I can help you, but I said, do this for me. Take a breath in through your nose, a breath out through your nose, pinch your nose. And I asked him to jog on the spot. And he jogged on the spot, holding his nose. And then he let go and he breathed in and his nose started opening up.
Yeah.
Now,
how long
I'm not saying that's the thing. It'll only open up for a short period of time. But if he keeps on doing it, and I told him as well, I said, the human nose is one of those things. If you breathe through your nose all the time, your nose works better for you. It gets better and better and better and better. But his thing was, he has nasal polyps, so he feels difficulty breathing through his nose. So then he goes around with his mouth open. He sleeps with his mouth open. And because he's not using his nose is getting worse. So sometimes we have to say, yeah, you want your nose to work better for you, start using it. Even if it feels a little bit of an air hunger, you might feel a little bit uncomfortable at the start. And it's not about pulling and pushing the air in and out of the body. You know, it's about just gently doing the exercises, opening up the nose, but doing them regularly.
Yeah,
and breathing through the nose. It's a training. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, great. So, well, I think I can continue for hours, but we don't do that. I really want to thank you, Patrick, for your time. It's great. And well, continue your work. And I hope when you watch this that you learned something. I did. And maybe I will see you later. And you too, Patrick. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Elaine. Thank you.